Welcome to the first unit in your training. Let's get rolling. In your job, you're going to be working directly with children with autism, and so it's important that you understand as much about this disorder as you can. In this unit, we'll introduce you to the fundamental features of this disorder. We'll discuss the different types of autism spectrum disorders. We'll talk about the prevalence and causes of autism. We'll ask whether there's a cure for this disorder, and we'll explore the unique learning needs of these children. So let's get started. Here's some general information that'll help us start answering the question, what is autism? Autism is a brain-based developmental disorder. Autism is not a disease or a sickness. You can't catch it. Autism affects a child's ability to interact and communicate with others. These children can struggle with social skills, and they can often have delays in communication as well as delays in developing language. So kids with autism often don't have the words to communicate with others and express their wants and needs. Autism has a variety of symptoms and characteristics that can appear in any combination and range in severity from mild symptoms to more serious symptoms. In very mild cases, symptoms may be barely noticeable, but in more severe cases, you may see children make repetitive motions for very long periods of time. In other instances, you may even see children who actually hurt themselves. No two children with autism are exactly alike. Symptoms usually start before the child is 3 years old and can cause delays or problems in different skills that develop from infancy all the way to adulthood. Now in this segment, you're going to be interacting with the first of our learning objects. This learning object will help you learn more about the behaviors and symptoms seen in children with autism. Here's a preview of what we'll review. There are 3 general domains used to distinguish common behaviors and symptoms associated with autism. First, impaired social interactions. Second, communication difficulties. And third, restricted, repetitive, and stereotype patterns of behavior, interests, and activities. Each of these 3 domains will appear in the learning objects. All you need to do is click on each of them to learn more about that particular domain. Welcome back. Now, in the last segment, you reviewed the three general domains of symptoms and behaviors associated with autism. As you can imagine, all the symptoms and behaviors that set these children apart from others can be pretty challenging for them. It's often difficult for children with autism to participate in activities with their peers or attend school in a regular classroom or even meet new people. It's also very important for you to know that a large percentage of children with autism also have intellectual disabilities, which used to be called mental retardation. And that also contributes to the learning difficulties that these children have. All right, now we're going to talk more specifically about something you may have heard before: autism spectrum disorders, or ASDs for short. So what is this spectrum of disorders? What exactly does that mean? Now, to help answer that question, my friend and colleague, Dr. Teresa Mitchell, is here today to tell us more. Teresa, welcome.
Hey, Richard.
Now, what do we mean by autism spectrum disorders?
Well, it used to be that we thought of autism as a single diagnosis, but what we started to notice was that the symptoms appeared in different ways for different people. So now it's conceptualized along a spectrum of disorders. So currently there are 3 disorders that fall along this continuum, and they all share certain characteristics with each other. So what you have is autism disorder, which is sort of the classic autism that you think about. Then there's Asperger's syndrome. And then there's pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. Some people think of that as atypical autism.
Okay, so let's get into the differences between those 3. Let's start with classic autism.
Okay, so in classic autism, you're going to see deficits in the 3 major domains that you guys have talked about already. There are going to be deficits in communication skills, in social skills, and there will be repetitive restrictive behaviors. So for someone who's going to encounter these children in certain settings, the first kinds of symptoms that you might see is that they'll have a hard time making eye contact with you, they'll be a little awkward, and they might not be able to articulate what's going on for them. If they've had a bad day or if they're not feeling well, they might not be able to actually say that to you, and you'll need to sort of figure out where they might be.
Okay, and how about Asperger's syndrome? What's the difference then between classic autism and Asperger's?
Well, people think of Asperger's as a milder version of the disorder. So what you will not see are intellectual disabilities. They will not have any problems with language. But what you will see are social deficits, repetitive interests, and sometimes problems with motor skills. So this may be the child who is doing very well in school but has a hard time making friends. He may have a little bit of awkward movement, difficulties with his gait. And he also may be the kid who is an expert in Pokemon, can talk about it all day long, but might not really want to talk about much of anything else.
All right, so for school-age kids with Asperger's who are in social groups and in various social situations, this could be a pretty difficult time for them.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Well, let's talk about the third disorder in the spectrum, PDD-NOS.
Yes, that's pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. The not otherwise specified part is important because what that's telling us is that these are kids who may have symptoms or characteristics of autism disorder or Asperger's syndrome, but they would not have enough to qualify for either diagnosis. Now, it's important that we retain the PDD-NOS diagnosis because these are kids who do have problems, and we want them to get services when we can.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand this. A child with PDD-NOS may or may not have one of the symptoms that we've already talked about?
That's right. Now, it gets a little bit tricky. So these are children who, when you meet them, you might not immediately suspect that they would fall along the autism spectrum. But when you test them and you look at their skills in depth, they definitely have deficits that fall within the category of autism spectrum disorders.
All right. Thanks so much for coming by. Really appreciate it.
Sure thing, Richard.
Now, to give us an idea of what the need is for well-trained professionals like teachers and therapists and paraprofessionals like yourself, I want to talk to Teresa about the prevalence of autism. Teresa, what can you tell us?
Well, the Centers for Disease Control have recently put out some new numbers. And so what they're saying is that about 1 out of every 110 children in the U.S. has an ASD diagnosis. That translates to about 730,000 individuals between the ages of birth and 21 years. So for new cases, what they're estimating is that there are about 4 million children born in the country every year. So about 36,500 of those new births will eventually go on to get an autism spectrum diagnosis.
That sounds like it's pretty devastating numbers. Is that on the increase?
Yes, there has been a recent rise in the incidence of the disorder, say from the late 90s through the early 2000s. The numbers have definitely risen. This is not just observed in the U.S., it seems to be worldwide.
Wow. And I understand that autism can strike boys and girls in different proportions. Is that right?
Boys are 4 times more likely to receive the diagnosis than girls are.
What about siblings?
Siblings are more likely to get the diagnosis than the general population. So the recurrence rate within a family is about 2 to 8%, again, more than the general population.
Okay, well, clearly ASDs are affecting a sizable number of families out there. But here's one thing that I think we need to go over. Why is this such a prevalent disorder? What causes ASDs in the first place? This is actually a pretty controversial topic, and you'll probably talk to a lot of people who have strong opinions about the causes of ASDs, or they may even have just a lot of questions. Now, in your work with children with ASDs, parents and colleagues are undoubtedly going to ask you to talk about the cause or causes of autism. And many people are going to want to know, what do you think causes autism? Well, let me ask you, Teresa, what do we know about the causes of autism?
Well, there are lots of theories out there, but right now, none of them has really been proven to be the answer. So where we stand, the answer is still unknown. So there's clearly a genetic contribution, and we know that from twin studies. So for example, with identical twins who share the same genetic makeup, if one child has an ASD, then the other will be affected by an ASD 60 to 96% of the time. In other non-identical twins who don't share all of the genetic makeup, if one child has an ASD, the other child is affected 0 to 24% of the time. So you can see that genes clearly play a role, but they're not the whole story.
What about environmental aspects or environmental causes of autism? Is that something that has been researched?
Well, there are clearly environmental factors, but right now we just don't know enough for there to be any definitive answers.
Okay. Well, if you pay attention to the popular media, one gets the sense that we really do know what causes autism.
Yeah, you'll read a lot about hypotheses about vaccines causing autism, hypotheses about diet causing autism, or even poor parenting styles causing autism. But we're behavioral scientists, and so we have to look at the scientific evidence. And right now, the scientific evidence doesn't support any of those hypotheses, so we can't support them either.
Okay. Well, listen, Teresa, thanks so much. This was really helpful. I appreciate you coming back.
Sure thing, Richard. My pleasure.
Okay. Now, in the last segment, we learned that the exact causes of autism are still unknown, but that multiple genetic and environmental influences may contribute to the cause of ASDs. In this section, we begin to explore what we can do about autism. Is there a cure? Can autism be treated? To help answer these questions, I've invited Dr. Rick Fleming to speak with us about this. Rick, welcome.
Thanks, great to be here.
So Rick, is there a cure for autism?
Well, unfortunately, the short answer to that is no. I mean, there's no special pill or diet or anything like that that can cure autism.
Okay, so in the absence of a formal cure, in the way that we think about cures, what is it that we can do about autism?
Well, there's so much that can be done. Research has shown that early intensive intervention can really help children develop these core social and communication skills that they're lacking. We refer to that as behavioral intervention, and early behavioral intervention done well can lead to a drastically better quality of life for these kids.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Rick. That was very helpful.
Oh, my pleasure.
All right. Now we're going to be hearing a lot more from Rick later on. Now in the next segment of this unit, we're going to address the specific learning needs of children with autism. Now, at the beginning of this unit, we introduced you to the defining characteristics of autism. You learned that we group symptoms of autism into 3 common domains: social and communication areas, as well as areas of restricted and repetitive behavior. We emphasized that while symptoms can be grouped into general categories, the actual symptoms in a child with autism are likely to be unique to that child. No two children with autism are exactly alike. Now, these children may share the following basic learning needs: staying seated independently in classroom or mealtime settings, making eye contact, especially in response to their name or "look at me," paying attention and maintaining attention, identifying and labeling objects and people, observing and imitating, including motor skills like clapping and actions with objects like throwing, and using language and effective communication skills, such as using a verbal or nonverbal response to indicate desired items or to make a request. Now, as basic learning skills get met, then you can move on to more advanced skills like following a two-step verbal instruction, such as comb your hair and put the brush away, identifying emotions, using sentences, answering why, where, and when questions, conducting self-help skills like dressing, toileting, or brushing teeth, taking other people's perspective, having more complicated back and forth exchanges, participating in peer play, taking turns, increased independence and mastery in academic, social, and emotional areas. Now, as you can see, the skills that children with ASDs may need support with and help learning are as varied as the symptoms that compose the spectrum of autistic disorders. This makes our job of treating autism much harder. If children with autism have varying symptoms and varying skill levels, they're likely to need varying treatments. And as you've learned, there is no cure for autism, no pill or medical intervention. There is also no single best treatment package for all children with autism. The research indicates that early intervention is important and that the treatment of children with autism is most effective when it's tailored specifically to each child, and it's highly structured and consistent. When we teach children with autism, we want to make sure that we're teaching in a way that examines each child's specific strengths and weaknesses, each child's specific learning needs, and each child's functioning level. You can use the list that I talked about as an example for what kinds of learning needs a child with an ASD might require. The basic skills must be addressed before more advanced skills can be addressed. In all cases, our work with children with special learning needs has the ultimate goal of increasing their independence and mastery of socially important skills and behaviors. All of the learning needs that I talked about are critically important for the child's continued growth and development cognitively, socially, physically, and emotionally. Okay, we're back with Dr. Rick Fleming, and he's going to help us understand a little bit more about how services are arranged for children with autism to meet their specific learning needs. Rick, what can you tell us?
Well, it starts with the need. Children with autism have a need to get a lot of one-to-one early intensive intervention. They need to learn basic attending and communication skills in order to move on from there. So in other words, we can't just throw a kid into the deep end of the pool without first teaching them how to tread water.
Okay. Now, I've heard of something called IDEA. How does that come into play here?
Yeah, that is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. And that is a law that federally mandates free and appropriate public education for students with disabilities. Fortunately, autism is a category of disability covered under IDEA.
All right, so how does IDEA actually lead to services for these children?
Right, good question. A team, which is made up of the family, special and regular education teachers, school administrators, developmental specialists, they need to get together and do an assessment. And that assessment looks at the child's strengths and capabilities and also weaknesses. So from that comes an individualized education plan, or IEP, and that is a plan, a teaching plan, that gets implemented in the classroom by highly trained teachers and paraprofessionals, and it addresses the children's needs. It capitalizes on strengths and works to address weaknesses.
Okay, I've heard about something called the least restrictive environment. What does that mean, Rick?
What that means is that children with autism, to the extent that they can, should be learning side by side with their typically developing or non-disabled peers. And that gets determined in the IEP, and peer interaction is maximized to the potential for that child.
Okay, and how does the No Child Left Behind Act come into play here?
That act is really important in really mandating that services be delivered by highly qualified personnel, teachers, paraprofessionals, and that those services be evidence-based.
Okay, that's great, because that's exactly what we're trying to teach in this course to paraprofessionals, evidence-based practice. Thanks a lot, Rick. Appreciate your coming in.
You're very welcome.
Well, I hope you're now starting to get a good feel for what autism is all about. And as I said earlier, it's important to understand the symptoms and characteristics of the children that you're going to be working with. Now, I strongly encourage you to go back and review this material. But before you do, let me give you the key points that you need to remember. Autism is a neurological developmental disability that affects about 1 in 110 individuals worldwide. It's not a disease. You can't catch it. It's usually diagnosed before the age of 3, and it results in difficulties in the domains of social interactions, communication, and repetitive and stereotyped behaviors. Therefore, children with autism have a wide range of specific learning needs. Autism spectrum disorders include autistic disorder, also called classic autism, Asperger's syndrome, and pervasive developmental disorders otherwise not specified. Classic autism is characterized by moderate to severe difficulties in all 3 of the symptom domains. A large percentage of these children also have intellectual disorders. Those with Asperger's syndrome may have typical intelligence and language skills, but often have difficulties with social interactions. PDD-NOS is a category of ASDs used to designate individuals that have some but not all of the characteristics that would classify them as having classic autism or Asperger's syndrome. Unfortunately, the precise causes of autism are not yet known, but there are many possible factors, both genetic and environmental, that may contribute to the development of an ASD. Finally, there is no cure. Importantly, we want to make sure that we stick with what we know based on the science and study of autism, and not get drawn into, well, I heard this or I heard that. Now, fortunately, there is hope for these children. While we cannot yet prevent autism, there is a way we can work with these children to help them learn and grow. Intensive and early behavioral intervention has been shown to be very effective for these children. And as Dr. Rick Fleming mentioned, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requires that children with special needs, like those with autism, have an individualized education plan in place to address their particular learning needs. And that's where you come in. You're going to be helping treatment professionals carry out treatment plans based on the science of applied behavior analysis, or ABA as it's often called. ABA has revolutionized the treatment of autism. Now, what is ABA? That's what we'll explore in depth in the next unit.